Critical Blast, where pop culture gets blasted.
I've always wanted to talk to this gentleman and get his insights on this phenomenon that has sprung up over the last couple of years of independent creators crowdfunding their books and crowdsourcing and just going it their own way without, you know, going to the established indie sources. So please welcome with me to the stream tonight, Mr. Doug Ernst. Doug, how you doing tonight?
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Now, I should have asked this while we were in the green room, but I see it's Douglas on here. Do you prefer Doug or Douglas? I don't want to insult you by calling you the wrong name.
Either way works. As long as you don't really call me Dougie, I'm pretty much okay with whatever. So even if you called me Dougie, I'd roll with it. When I was a kid, I used to hate it though.
I hear that. I used to be a Lenny because it was a nickname that my parents gave me, and I never quite understood it. I think they were Laverne and Shirley fans. So when I got to college, it was like, nope, I'm ditching that name.
At least they didn't call you Squiggy.
Yeah, well, I had enough of that in grade school too. So you're just coming off of a campaign of your own with the Soul Finder. How much did that meet your expectations?
Oh, I couldn't be more grateful for everybody that backed Soul Finder last year and continuing on into this year, because we're still selling it on iconiccomics.com, which has a bunch of my artists on Soul Finder, Timothy Lim, and colorist Brett R. Smith. Matt Weldon, who is on Black Tide, the upcoming book, he was in that. So Iconic Comics they're continuing to sell it. It's doing well there. It did well last year when we were on Indiegogo, and it exceeded all my sort of expectations. So for a first-time author is getting into this is my foray into indie comics. I was very happy with everybody that backed it.
Now, I'm sure everybody already knows this is your first comic book.
Right. Correct.
But you've been writing professionally for quite some time now, with the Washington Times. Have you done any fiction before that of any kind?
No, other than fiction that's been sitting on my shelf. There is like a novel that I need artwork for that eventually, once I get artwork that I'm happy with, then I will release that as well. So there is a piece of of fiction that I would like to release one day, but not until I get the art that matches. There's a character who sort of sketches along this sort of journey that they're on, and so I need art that matches what he sees during the course of the journey.
I gotcha. Sort of like the maps that would go in Lord of the Rings as they would go from one place to the next. Okay, that's cool. What drew you into comics, and how long have you been a fan of this?
So I've been a fan of comics since I was a little kid. People that have followed me know that my oldest brother, used to read Spider-Man and Iron Man to me on an ugly green couch in one of our family's first homes. And that's basically how I learned to read, on Spider-Man and Iron Man comic books. And then from there, my other brother was a Daredevil and X-Men fan. And then my sister, she actually read Silver Surfer a little bit, and then like other random stuff. So all the kids would use their allowance money and they would buy their favorite character, and then we'd be able to trade amongst ourselves to read the other books.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that. I learned to read before kindergarten off of Superman comics that I scavenged from places around town, barber shops and stuff like that. They didn't sell them where I lived, but
very cool.
I can definitely relate to that. So eventually you got around to wanting to actually do a comic book. Now, how long did you want to do Soul Finder as a story? Because I don't know if it was something that you were working on and then crowdfunding came along and became, here's a way to do it, or if you were, looking at crowdfunding and saying, this looks like something I could do, let's process it. Chicken and egg sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I've always loved comic books, and then so in the back of my mind, if you grow up reading comics and even drawing in your spare time, you imagine putting out your own comic. And so as I got older, obviously I started working at the Washington Times, and that's obviously not creative writing in any sort of way. But then I was doing a blog, and I was criticizing the industry in terms of the lack of professionalism and actually the storytelling in mainstream Marvel, particularly Spider-Man, for many years. And then once I got into doing YouTube videos and YouTube criticism of the industry, that's where I met Timothy Lim, and we actually started talking offline about religion and faith. And so we're both practicing Catholics. And so it was through my friendship with Tim that somewhere along, basically we were talking about ideas for comic books, and I was like, oh, I have this idea about this, this priest, and I basically was explaining Soul Finder. He explained when he was a kid, he had a story that he wanted to tell in terms of a G.I. Joe character that was like the counterweight to Cobra's black magic or something along those lines. And so we were just like, oh, it's a natural fit. And Tim introduced me to Brett R. Smith. He introduced me to Dave Dorman, introduced me to Matt Weldon, and then it sort of kind of took off from there.
And it's almost like you guys have formed not just independent publishing, but an independent publishing house. Is that correct? Is that a good way of looking at it? I mean, you mentioned Iconic Comics.
It's basically a network of guys that are all on the same page in terms of their general temperament, the kind of creative output that they expect, how they feel about the craft of storytelling, artwork, all that sort of stuff. So myself, Tim, Matt, Brett, Johnny, the guy who runs Iconic Comics, we're all just basically on the same page. And I don't know, it's sort of, everything just sort of gelled. So I don't know exactly what you would call it, but we're definitely bouncing ideas off of each other, working with each other. So the box, the packaging for Tim's next book, for the next Black Hops, and then for the next Soul Finder, we showed this on like a previous live stream where all of our characters are on the boxes on the box together. So we're definitely some sort of creative team, but we're also friends as well.
Okay. A lot of as I look at what's happening in comics today, I hear a lot of the talk about how the comics industry is collapsing. It's in its death throes, and there may be something to that for the bigger comic book publishers like DC and Marvel. I don't think they're going to die. I think they may shrink quite a bit and then maybe come back slowly over time as fandom redevelops itself. But I see this more as a renaissance period in independent publishing because there are so many more new characters and new publishers showing up. And I think crowdfunding's been a large part of that. I was interested in, do you see it that way, or are you more on the side of, yeah, this is a last gasp kind of thing?
Well, a lot of times, so the industry plays all sorts of weird shell games with what's going on in terms of what's selling and what's not. And so do you consider manga or traditional superheroes? You could compare sales of that versus manga. Then there's always those shell games with the variant covers where they release like 30 or 40 variant covers and then kind of pass that off as like healthy sales, when really you just have these collectors. Or basically the retailers are, you're putting them in weird situations where they have to buy huge numbers and then try and make it up by selling, the one in, 5,000 variant cover or whatever the heck it is. So I think it's definitely changing, it's morphing. But like you said, technology allows these indie creators to just kind of do their own thing. And with social media, you could create a bond with a customer base that you would have never had like been able to cultivate in the 1980s or the 1990s. And so I could just be on YouTube with you. I could be on Twitter. I could be on Instagram, all over the place, and slowly build my base. And as long as I'm putting out a good product once a year or whatever, on average, or whatever the heck it is, I think you'll be good to go, and you don't need to really worry about what other people are doing. It's just a matter of if you care if you're like actually in a comic shop or not. Some people would care about that, but I don't particularly care.
Okay. I'm the same way. I would like to get a monthly book of some of the things I've seen crowdfunded, but I know that that's not possible as of yet until somebody gets funded to such a level that they can self-fund and self-perpetuate from that point forward. But you mentioned that this was something that wasn't available in the 80s and 90s, and I realize this takes some, theorizing and some what if on your part to answer this question. But what if crowdfunding and the internet was a thing in the early 90s when you had the image revolution, where all these creators were coming out of the big two saying we want creator-owned properties? If they'd been able to crowdfund independently, in my mind, there wouldn't have been an Image. And I don't know if the comics that Image produced then, the Spawns and the Savage Dragons and all the other stuff, would have gone on as long as they did, or would even be remembered, today, 30 years later.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a tough. I mean, you could play those what if games. It's very interesting to see how things would have played out differently. But I don't know. That's one where I can't play Doctor Strange and see all those different realities and what would have happened with Spawn had it gone directly to like a crowd fund. I'm not sure.
Okay, well, what about the crowdfunding today? I mean, is this something that you see as a viable long-term market? I mean, do you see, I know you haven't plotted nearly this far out, but do you see, like it's the 100th issue of Soulfinder, or so, if they said Soulfinder, yeah.
Right. Well, for me personally, I have multiple stories that I would like to tell. And as long as I have an artist, whether it's a Tim or a Matt or somebody else, and a colorist like Brett R. Smith that wants to color my work, then I'm happy to keep making stories. And I don't really see, unless one of these, so the problem for me is actually you never know if the social media platform is going to nuke your account for some weird reason or other. So my Twitter account in the past, it actually has been taken down for 30 days, and I didn't even do anything. Like, I won't get into that story, but it was gone. It was nuked for 30 days over a bogus reason. And so YouTube or Twitter, they could cut you off from your audience that you spent years and years building up in a heartbeat. And so that's kind of scary. But I guess if you have an email list, you could keep in contact with them, so it's easier to replenish. So that's actually my biggest fear, or the biggest threat, is having these social media giants cut me off from my own customers.
Yeah, you almost need to maintain, I don't mean multiple accounts, but multiple outlets on social media. You have to have the YouTube and the Facebook and the Twitter, because if any one of them decides to cut you off, you need to be able to reach everybody. It's very similar to what a lot of independent creators went through before crowdfunding came up, where they would all go through Diamond, which had a monopoly. And if Diamond, for whatever reason, thought that you were not worth their time, they wouldn't list you. And then you would just lose all your communication with your customer, which at that point was the retailer, and they wouldn't be able to order your book.
Right.
But here you're right. If Twitter takes you down, then you lose a lot of your traffic to your Indiegogo, to your Kickstarter, or what have you.
And I could see all the sales data on Indiegogo. I could see exactly where everybody was coming from, how they got to the book before they ordered it. And so if Twitter were to cut me off, that would be not devastating, but it would be a huge chunk of the sales came from my Twitter promotions. And so that would hurt pretty badly.
So you've written about comics for the Washington Times for your blog. Have you done anything for the Washington Times on the comics industry?
No, I generally tend to stay away from anything that would be, I don't know, I want to say like a conflict of interest, or if they would say like, oh, he only essentially did this story because he was going after so-and-so. There are some things that sort of, I write on Hollywood entertainment, and celebrities sometimes get political. And so I will write on those issues. But in terms of the actual industry, certain individuals that I've had run-ins with online in terms of their comic books on my YouTube channel or on the blog, I try and stay far away from them and not mix that with work. Although in the past, like a few years ago, people were contacting my employer and doing weird things. And I had to basically explain to my boss that there were individuals within indie comics that didn't particularly like me, and that's why they were essentially trying to cause problems at my place of employment.
Yeah, that whole cancel culture aspect of which I never saw before 2016. Maybe it existed in forms of like, boycotts and stuff like that, but I've never seen anything like what we're seeing in the culture today, where, somebody finds out a reason not to like you and they do everything they can on social media, which gives them all the information they need most of the time about a person, to start reaching out to employers and form these harassment campaigns.
Yeah, and there was one individual, again, these are anonymous people that do stuff, but this individual was just taking screenshots of bigoted things on Twitter that have nothing to do with me, and then tagging my employer, the Twitter account, and saying, your employee, Douglas Ernst, this is who he's friends with. And it was like it was fictitious. It was made up. But again, it's one of those things where your boss sees this and is like, what is going on around here? Like, what is this? And then you have to explain, these are unhealthy, unwell people, and they're just making stuff up so I have to have a conversation like we're having right now.
Yeah. And if you don't have that kind of a relationship with your employer, a lot of employers are of the kind, I want to come to work. I want to get my business done. I want to go home. I don't want to have to deal with this crap. As long as you're here, I have to deal with this crap. I'll get somebody else to do your job so I don't have to deal with this crap.
Yeah. And luckily for me, so working at the newspaper, they're used to people going off the deep end and sending irate emails or making phone calls and trying to get in contact with people, leaving nasty messages. So on some level, like, thankfully, I'm inoculated to some extent from that sort of thing. They expect it, but I feel bad for anybody. Say you were just working, years ago when I was in college, I worked the overnight shift at Target, or, whatever. You're just working at a regular job somewhere. Like you said, your employers, they're just like, I don't want to deal with this. I don't have time for this. If you can't settle this, you're going to have to go, sort of thing. And it's sad that we've reached that point.
Oh, yeah. I tell the story. I've worked many different IT jobs, and I worked with a friend who was a contractor. Contractors even less liked than the employees. Not liked, but you can replace a contractor much more easily than you can an employee.
Right.
And I looked around one day, he wasn't there, and I found him a couple of weeks later. And he's like, "Yeah, I went to the Anime Con in downtown St. Louis. I forget the actual name of the Anime Con, and there were pictures of him there that showed up in the arts and entertainment section of the newspaper. Here's Anime Con." And somebody at the company who was an employee went to HR and said, this person went to a pornography convention and was in the paper. And there was no, were you at a convention of this kind, for him to say, no, this is Japanese anime. It was like, we don't need you anymore. And then they told him why.
Right.
So it's a soft target, really. People's jobs are very soft targets unless you work for yourself, I think.
Exactly. Yeah.
But now you kind of sort of do, with the work you're doing on SoulFinder and doing some crowdfunded comics. Is SoulFinder the only thing you're looking at crowdfunding as a comic book?
No, there's a couple other. So the thing with SoulFinder is, so for those that aren't up on it, it's basically combat veterans that became exorcists, and so there's a major order of exorcists, and that's the criteria. You have to have been on the front lines, downrange. And so you can tell stories that go back hundreds of years. You could connect them to any sort of war around the world. And so people are like, are you going to do a World War I story? Are you going to do a Civil War story? And I'm like, yes, I would be happy to do that if I had more time. So I have a number of stories that are lined up. There's a Vietnam story that I would like to tell. There's at least one or two more stories with Father Redder, the main character in a Demons match, that I would like to tell. But then there's a couple other, there's a more traditional superhero tale that I would like to crowdfund one day. And then there's another story about a heroic cop I was talking with Brett R. Smith about not too long ago that I would like to do something along those lines. But my work at the newspaper, it just sucks up so much of my time that I really only have time to do sort of like one decent project a year at this point in time.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that. I've got the day job too, and it bites into the novel writing time. And this is, as long as I'm doing this at night, that also chews into it. I need that 48-hour day to do everything I really want to do. But
Right.
or give up
There's not
sleep.
enough time in the day to do. It's like I would like to do more YouTube videos. I would like to go back to blogging. That's my love, is just writing and blogging and doing those sorts of things. But family responsibilities, professional responsibilities. It's just suddenly you're like, where did the time go? Where did 2020 go? I don't even know where 2020 went.
I know. I mean, I've been working from home since March because they sent us all home for the beer bug, and they've told the IT department, you're not coming back till the first of the year.
Right.
At first, I was like losing track of days because of like, I'm putting my timesheet in. I'm like, oh wait, I can't put it in yet. It's not Friday, it's Thursday. I forgot what day it was, and now I'm like, is it September or August? It's just all blended together. It's really a weird time warp kind of thing to live like this and work from home, but I guess people get used to it. With Soulfinder, because they're doing these exorcisms and all these rituals and rites, did you do any research into this, or is it all, hey, it's demons, I'm going to make it up as I go along, it's my own consistently logical universe?
No, there was a lot of research that went into it. I mean, it helps that myself and Timothy Lim are both practicing Catholics, so that helps. And then I had two other Catholic guys that I know. They actually helped and read and make sure that I wasn't going to be called a heretic. But there were a number of books that I read to make sure that I could speak with some form of authority on it. And then afterwards, I heard from priests and deacons. They were like, well, I was actually surprised this is theologically sound. So for Black Tide, for instance, I'm reading The Ascent of Mount Carmel by St. John of the Cross. And so this is collected work, so it's bigger than it seems. But all of the stories that I'm writing, there's a lot of research that goes into it. So I might read 200 or 300 pages just to get, there's like one or two pages out of a book that I'm like, oh, this would work for this particular story. I could use this as a creative springboard. I could pull this line and this could be like the foreword, or I could, there's all sorts of stuff you could do, but you have to dig through a lot of reading material to basically get a book that, for me, that I'm proud of, that I could put my name on.
Now, the Soul Finders, they're a unique form of exorcists, because you mentioned that they're all veterans. So are they going after a unique form of demon, or is it just wherever they encounter them, they take them on?
Sure. There's basically a demon called Blackfire that we created, and this demon has a cult that surrounds him. And so this is like an eternal battle that they have been formed to combat this particular evil. And because demons are eternal, you could defeat him temporarily, but he will be back again. So until the end of time, basically until Christ returns, the Soul Finders are charged. It is their solemn duty to essentially thwart Blackfire's his plans throughout time, essentially. But then obviously because they're exorcists, other evil other demons could pop up here and there or whatnot, but primarily it's one demon that is their objective in terms of derailing his plans.
So I'm not laughing at the story idea, but I'm laughing at what it reminded me of, which was you remember the Ghostbusters cartoon when they were all going after the different ghosts, but all the ghosts work for the one big bad ghost. That's kind of got what I was thinking of Blackfire there. He's the one big bad demon that sends the littler demons out to vex the Soul Finder crew. And yes. I like exorcism stories because here in St. Louis, we're all kind of exorcist attuned at Halloween, since The Exorcist, the real story that it was based on, happened here, and all the landmarks are St. Louis landmarks where this thing happened, the Alexian Brothers Hospital and all that stuff.
Yeah, no, the property, you could go in all sorts of different directions with it because they're combat veterans. So for the second one, it's actually ties into, there's Navy SEALs, there's basically the U.S. Army Night Stalkers are involved. They're like the elite helicopter pilots. So there's a national security threat. So you could focus more on their military skills and those sorts of things, or you could zoom in and you could tell these like intimate little tales. So the first one was more, I don't know, it was Father Redder's origin story basically, but it's kind of like a psychological I don't know, examination of this particular one character. So I could either zoom in or I could zoom out. I could tell big adventure tales, or I could tell this classic sort of like exorcism tale where it's just affecting one person. There's a wide range of things that I could do with the property.
Okay, now I saw on the cover for the second one that it looks to be taking place undersea. You got the tentacles, you got a shark in the background, and my first thought was that you were going to maybe take on some sort of a Lovecraftian theme with that. Is that the case, or is it just a totally different?
So the weird thing is, so that particular the fish you see in the background is actually an anglerfish. I think you could probably, if you check it out again, you'll see his little lure on there. So there's a demonic anglerfish that's involved. I know that sounds really weird, but essentially the demon, the lure, is basically some sort of sinful behavior or thoughts or some sort of something to get you to get off the narrow path towards God. And so they lure you in, and then once you come to the lure, then the demons got you. That sort of thing. But this particular tale is, there's a miraculous Eucharist that is at the bottom of the ocean off the coast of Maryland. There's a nuclear submariner or former nuclear submariner who got into the occult, and he has a band of other military vets that got into the occult, and they need this Eucharist for a black mass that will bring about a demon called Abyss into the world. And so it's basically a race between the soul finders and these occultist military types to get to this Eucharist and stop this black mass from occurring and stopping this demon from coming into the world, which is again associated with the bigger demon, Blackfire.
Yeah, that rings a chord with me in other things that I've thought about when it comes to stopping a demon from doing its business, especially with movies like The Omen and such like that, where it's like, the Antichrist is among us, we must find him and kill him, or else it's the end of days. And the thought that always strikes me is, isn't that what we've been wanting? It's, if the Antichrist is showing up, why are we trying to stop him when we know that means that we get to go home any second now?
Yeah, I don't know. So you're asking me, why does Soul Finder basically, why don't they just say, like, step back and be like, hey, let the
Yeah.
So yeah, well, it's one of those things where they are charged with always trying to thwart evil. God is going to come back on his timeline, not our timeline. And so it's not really, if I had to just off the top of my head say, like, why don't you just step back and let evil do its thing? It's like, well, then no, that's not really, you're not permitted to do that. Your job is just to be the best person that you can be in the eyes of God, and then God will determine when he will come back like a quote unquote thief in the night for all of those individuals that are not ready and not in a state of grace when they should be. And so, yeah, it's the soul finders should not be trying to organize some sort of essentially working with evil and on some weird level. So hopefully God will just come back if it burns to the ground quick enough or something along those lines. Yeah. I don't know.
I use that for the plot of my Destroyer novel, Bully Pulpit, where, it's like, what if the bad guy was a televangelist who really, really wanted to save people and was tired of seeing, people fall away from the faith, and found a way to destroy the earth, knowing that he couldn't do so because God would have to come back and stop him first. And it's like, wishing himself a curse that his brethren might be saved, like the Apostle Paul wrote that he wished he could do. And it was a fun exploration of the idea. Of course, Remo Williams stops him, but because otherwise there's not another book if the earth is destroyed.
Right.
Where we keep our stuff. Talking more about the culture war, though, and especially the culture war as it relates to comics. If you look at it objectively, are we really seeing a shift in mainstream comics, or are we just seeing peaks of things that stick out to people as far as major turns? I mean, is it as pervasive as a lot of people say it is? Or are there just, new elements added to the mainstream that, hey, this sticks out like a sore thumb here and I don't like it, and, rather than ignore it, I'm going to attack it?
Yeah, so basically your audio cut out for like 1 or 2 seconds on my end. I didn't catch that first part. Were you asking if the culture war is essentially overrated or there's a pendulum switch that will happen? I'm
Uh,
sorry, I missed that first couple parts. It
yeah,
cut
the
off.
stupid Bluetooth. But basically, is the culture war in comics? Yeah, is it overrated? I mean, is there really that far of a swing, widespread in mainstream comics, or is it just we've seen some things change and they're the things we focus on, and the rest of it is still the same if we were to look at it objectively?
Yeah, I think sometimes people they attributed things to the comic book industry. Like they almost acted like what's happening in the comic book industry is almost in a vacuum, and that you could like make it change. But to me, what's going on in the comic book industry is just a symptom of an overall sickness in the culture. And so you're going to see it whether it's in movies and video games and television shows and comic books. It shows up everywhere. And so unless there is a cultural shift and that pendulum does swing back, I don't think the problems that are going on in comics in terms of you essentially have these ideologues that are for many years now have tried to essentially, they've changed it from a focus on storytelling and the craft of storytelling to it's propaganda, and then the storytelling is like, that's nice and all, but really we're about making people feel good if they think the right way. And so I don't know. I don't see I don't see it really getting that much better. There's always going to be like good books here and there, but it seems to me that the percentage of good books continues to shrink. It's like harder and harder to find true storytellers, and then the artist paired with a true storyteller.
Yeah, I can. There are fewer options out there to read and enjoy these days. And even if maybe I'm just getting old and more discerning in what I want to read, but even if there's not an agenda in the book, it just seems like there's not a story in the book anymore. I went through all of Dynamite's last Daredevil series, Death-Defying Devil. I'm sorry, I know it's his original real name, but they can't use it. And it was literally started off with him eating a sandwich and then serving dinner sometime in the middle of the story, and then serving somebody else a sandwich at the end of it. It's like, this is not a superhero story anymore. This is a diner story.
Right. That's the thing that and this might be unfair to some extent, but it seems like a lot of these younger writers, they don't really believe in anything. They're moral relativists. They don't believe in right or wrong. They haven't really done anything except watch Comedy Central their entire life, and they're filled with this sort of snarky, sort of Daily Show sort of humor. And so they don't write about big ideas and big things and grand adventures because they're just so I think we were talking about this before in the green room. It's like the culture is so coarse. Everything is a joke. Everything is like, there's this flippant attitude. Whereas back in the day, you had people writing superhero tales that had literally been to World War II and then come back. And they had seen, they literally fought against evil, real evil, not just sort of manufactured evil in their mind where they just believe anybody in the United States who disagrees with them politically is a bad person. And so you're just getting these Food Network sort of stories when really it's not superhero tales anymore, or it's harder and harder to actually get superhero tales.
Yeah, and I'm thankful that I've got my 27 long boxes over here of 70s and 80s comics, because I can get a really long and detailed superhero story beginning to end in a single issue of 22 pages. And I don't know how folks like Jerry Conway and Kurt Swan did that, but because now it's like the same story I would read in 22 pages would be at least 6 issues in the modern telling style of panels and words and decompression of story. But you
these days. Oh, sorry. No, I was gonna say I haven't even really been reading like the new comics these days. I've been going back, and when I go to the comic shop, I'm buying the old stuff from the 80s that I didn't get to read the first time around. So there's all sorts of Spidey comics that I missed issues here and there when I was a kid. So I've been picking up those, and Daredevil and Iron Man and all these sorts of things instead of the new books, because like you said, why do I want to read Daredevil as essentially a Food Network star? I don't want to read that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you mentioned that, the current crop of writers, the younger generation here, doesn't believe in much of anything, but I think they do believe in one thing, and that is that whatever it is that they believe they're right in it,
Right.
to a zealot's degree, and I see that in the almost whiplash kind of reaction that comes from them if anybody criticizes the work or the industry. You've seen that with your own blog, where, if you criticize the industry, it's not so much well, I don't see it that way, but, maybe you're looking at it the wrong way. No, it's like, let's call your employer and let's make you a supervillain in a book, and let's just do everything we can to demonize and vilify you.
Right. Yeah, and some people might not know that, but after I had been criticizing Max Bemis's Moon Knight, roughly like 5 or 6 months later, there was a character called Ernst who was basically a villain, and I'm trying to save you from the YouTube algorithm here, but we'll just say like a very evil guy, and he was just referred to the entire time as Ernst, and so simultaneously, Max was doing interviews on, I want to say it was either Bleeding Cool or CBR, or one of those, where he literally said, like, I use these books essentially to work out my own issues. So it was a mighty coincidence that this guy who says he uses things that are going on in his life to work them out, and then suddenly you have this Ernst villain show up in Moon Knight, and it's like, interesting.
Yeah, it's I think a lot of writers are using their opportunity to write comics to work out their own issues. I think Tom King has been known to work out his depression issues throughout things like Heroes in Crisis and Batman, or at least it's been referenced in reviews of his work.
And that's something where if somebody wants to do an indie comic and they want to use their indie comic to sort of untangle whatever psychological or spiritual knots that they're going through, like, that's fine to me because it's your own property. But when you are trusted with Batman and Spider-Man and Iron Man and Superman and all these sorts of characters, and you're essentially using them to work out your personal issues, that's what I've always had a problem with, where it's like, obviously you can't separate your stories are going to be informed by your life, but when people start saying like, okay, it's pretty clear that this guy is only projecting his own problems onto Bruce Wayne, then we have a problem.
Yeah. And it definitely, it's something, if you want to do an indie book about your own personal beliefs on something, create new characters, that's great. Taking advantage of the opportunity that you have because you've been handed the reins to a long-standing property and then turning them into a ventriloquist dummy for your own issues is a lot of what's turned people away from the modern comics industry today. I think that, this has been done in the past in a more creative way by more creative writers who wanted to expound on issues, but they found characters that naturally fit and would naturally say the things they were wanting to say. Classic example of this would be Denny O'Neil's Green Lantern, Green Arrow series that he did, where they were the hard-traveling heroes, and Green Lantern was the conservative and Green Arrow was the liberal, and they each got to say things that came naturally to them, but still addressed real social issues of the day that could have been kind of touchy. Especially the heroin addiction and the civil unrest that was going on in the country.
Yeah, and that's another thing. So what the creators today do is they'll say things like, "Oh, well, there's always been politics in comics," and it's like, okay, you're doing this straw man argument sort of thing. It used to be, it wasn't omnipresent politics that were in the comics. They were there, and then they were also not mean-spirited, where anybody who disagrees with this is a bad person. It was typically, when it was done, it was more broad brushstroke sort of things, or they kind of, it was more at a philosophical level, and the story came first, And then it just so happened that the politics were also addressed in the story. Whereas today, they're just beating you over the head with like a propaganda cudgel and saying, believe what I believe, or else you are just a worthwhile or worthless person. You're a deplorable person and you're irredeemable. And so there's a very, like, again, the cultural shift happened where it's like the politics of the 1970s and when it worked its way into books is not the same as 2020, not even close.
Yeah. Do you see that maybe swinging back anytime in the near future? I mean, it's impacted sales. I think that's, very few people who have noticed it would argue that it has not impacted sales. Certainly to the point that DC is cutting everything back. AT&T has told Warner Brothers to tell DC to cut things off and start narrowing it down to things that actually sell. With that being the case, do you think people are going to start focusing on, hey, I need to keep my job more than I need to get my philosophy out there?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because so many bridges have been burned over the past, we'll just say even like decade with all of this stuff, that it's really hard to basically push a reset button or wipe the slate clean. I think if a lot of creators just outright apologized and there was some sort of contrition that you could actually see and say, like, listen, we want to get back to just classic storytelling and get rid of all this political tripe or what, that would be one thing. But I don't see them doing that. You could see their social media feeds. You could see who the ideologues are, and they fully believe it does not matter what happens. They're like, oh, well, these people went away. Good riddance to bad rubbish. So they're true believers in whatever ideology they're pushing. And so that's where it comes back to crowdfunding, where I think it's important because over time, the proof is in the pudding. You will see the people that are serious, that are putting out stories and they care about their customers. They care about storytelling. So for Soul Finder, I have customers that are liberal. They generally tend to be muted on Twitter. They don't say too much, but I have conservatives. I have people that are practicing Catholics. I have people that are atheists. And the overall, I'm very proud in a sense that the feedback was, hey, you didn't condescend to me. You weren't mean-spirited. You were just trying to tell a good story, but you're a Catholic dude. And so to me, I was like, thank you. Like, because that's what I set out. That's what I was trying to do. And I think over time, if you have writers and artists who are trying to recapture that sort of wonder that came when you were a little kid reading these comic books, they'll stand out over the long haul.
Yeah. Now, I know I mentioned that, the mainstream writers who backlash against any criticism have a zealotry to them. I should point out that zealotry is not, they don't have the market cornered on all of that, because even the creators who have been squeezed out of the industry, so to speak, who've gone independent with crowdfunding, the whole Comicsgate movement that sprung up out of that, and then the many splinterings that came out of that. I've used the analogy before that I think if the big two were the Catholic Church, then the initial Comicsgate movement was probably Martin Luther hanging his notice up on the door, and then it's split and splintered into so many different Protestant Comicsgate denominations to where they're like, we're not even Comicsgate, we're some other sort of offshoot now.
That is a pretty good analogy. I do like that quite a bit, and that's where the problem comes in, is you keep having this splintering and this fracturing, and suddenly you have 10,000 denominations and everybody has, and so it's like, well, what is what does anything even mean anything anymore? Or like, what is going on around here? And people they want some sort of cohesive ideology or the principles or ideals that they could actually hold on to. But I do not know who the Joel Olstein is of in independent comics, but yeah, it's definitely fractured for sure.
Yeah, I know who the Westboro Comicsgate fracture group is, but that's another story entirely. But they do have their own zealots within each of them, because they're like, you're not pure. You believe in this sort of a thing. Therefore, what are you doing calling yourself a crowdfunder or a comic skater or whatever it is? And I think that that's going to, all that does is fuel each side. The zealots on each side fuel the other side into the point where a normal person is going to look at this stuff and say, I don't even want to bother with it, which hurts the crowdfunders because you have to actually seek out the crowdfunded comic books, as opposed to, if there was a comic store in your neighborhood, you just kind of walk in while you're doing your other downtown shopping and see what's there, and you grab something, you walk out. You don't have to know who wrote it or care about what they said about, the president or the elections or anything else.
Yeah, and it's weird because there's a gravitational drama pull or something where people will reach out to you, and everybody has these like little fights, and they like try and get like I could even have time to keep up with all of these different fights and these factions that form. And they're like, well, why aren't you talking about this or that or the other thing? And I was like, I don't have time to get into your personal life and like whatever happened with your team, and if it derailed or spun out of control, like I don't, and so I have always tried to basically say, like, listen, when I first started, I was about strong storytelling, strong art, and professionalism. And so that's what I want to try and focus like a laser on. And any of this other side stuff that starts happening, and this guy doesn't like this guy, and this guy doesn't like this guy, and this guy, he's Judas, he stabbed me in the back, and all this sort of, it's just like, once you go down that road where you start trying to play a referee for everybody's little personal fight, then you are going to get sucked into it. And so I have tried very hard to just say, like, listen, I'm focusing on my book and my creative team, and I do not want to get involved in anybody else's spats with each other.
Yeah, and of course, by not picking a side, you can always get assigned one,
right.
which has happened to a lot of people who are supportive of Comicsgate didn't necessarily join the Comicsgate movement as much as they were told that they were in Comicsgate by people who didn't like them, which it's a movement, I guess, that more people have been, or as many people have been pushed into as were pulled into. There was
basically hit pieces that were in the Miami, I think it was Miami Herald, was it? And Washington Post, the Daily Beast. I think those were the main three. I'm sure there were others where, and you had these creators that they were essentially calling people like myself and others Comicsgate. And so then it just became a thing like, okay, well, if Mark Waid and Dan Slott and these guys are going to call me Comicsgate, then sure. Oh, okay, I will embrace whatever they want to slime me with. That's fine. But I've always, like I said, I've tried to stick to talking about ideals and principles, and that storytelling, art, professionalism, just those three things. If you have that stool, sort of that three-legged stool right there, and you just focus on that, you'll be fine. But then when people start coming up with like 10,000 different definitions of what constitute Comicsgate, it's like, now that I'm a creator, now that I have Soulfinder art, it's like, I don't want to get involved in the readers' debates or the customers' debates and tell them what to think or what to say or how to define this or that. It's like, there's many things that I would like to weigh in on, but if I'm trying to be professional, the last thing that I want to do is start playing referee in terms of like, well, your definition is wrong and you need, so it's just like, if I'm professional, it'll all work itself out in the wash. That's, at least hopefully, that's the premise that I'm working from, is that just be as professional as possible, and people can define me all they want, but at the end of the day, if they're like, dude, Soulfinder was a really good story and it had really good art and the customer service was great, then in the long run, over the course of 2, 3, 4, 5 years, then it will pay off for me, and all the other stuff will just be white noise.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how long you thought you might think it would take for the toxicity of the whitewashing of Comicsgate as a toxic group. I mean, there was the article people were talking about this weekend in the Arkansas Times. It was about the Brightwisers, because they're local Arkansas people, and they were talking about their publishing house that they're getting off the ground and getting into Walmart. And then about halfway through the story, it talked about a backlash against the Brightwisers because they were friendly to the wrong people in the toxic comic book community. And I don't know who wrote the piece, but I don't think they actually did much of an interview with, some of these crowdfunded people. It was more of did a quick Twitter search and saw, oh, toxic.
Right.
And how long before, it just becomes, oh yeah, there was this time when people hated this group because they called them names, but we know they just create comic books now.
Well, it's weird because every, we'll say 8 to 10 months, there's essentially a new population of people that are being introduced to indie comics, and they don't know the history of 19, 18, 17, even 2016 in terms of all of this sort of stuff. And so it's like with the internet, everything, it's like the fossils in the ground, all these different layers, people forget. And then it's on some level, you almost get to start anew. And that's where, again, just being professional, it will pay off in the long run, because a year from now, all the little fights, internal fights, maybe there's an esoteric, it's like a little small population of people that know who hates who and this and that and the other thing. But to me, as long as you keep putting out good products, and so I've always said, I don't care if somebody wants to have a serious conversation with me on Soulfinder, and I could tell that they're being sincere and they want to have a real discussion, I'll talk to them about it. And if somebody wants to try this sort of guilt by association game with me, I'm not going to play around with that and be like, I don't really care. So for me personally, I can't speak on any of the other creators out there putting out books, but I will just go on whoever's channel I think wants to have a serious conversation about storytelling. And the mainstream industry is always going to, they've hated my guts for years. They've called me every name in the book. And so it doesn't matter whether I go on a quote unquote Comicsgate channel or not, they're always going to hate me and they're always going to slime me and try and hurt my reputation. So I don't care if someone interviews me who is quote unquote anti-Comicsgate or Comicsgate or War Campaign or this or that or the other thing. I just care about talking about my book in a intellectual and mature way.
Yeah, I've come out before and said that I'm pro Comicsgate, I'm pro DC Comics, I'm pro Marvel Comics, pro Dynamite, pro Valiant. I want to read good comic books, and I realize that there are. I don't want to curse on my show, but there are jerks in every one of those industries that
right.
That are loud ones, and it seems like every group tries to get defined or ends up getting defined externally by the lowest elements of that group. Mm-hmm. So, and there's nothing you can do about it. I mean, it's maybe if you're DC, if you're at DC Comics, they say, well, they're independent contractors, they're freelancers. We don't have any HR that has control over it. If you're an independent publisher, well, Comicsgate is a hashtag. We don't control anybody who puts a hashtag in there. There's no formal group. You can't kick them out. I just think
that's always been a pet peeve of mine, where people will reach out to me and they'll say, so and so YouTuber said this. Do you defend that, or do you and it's just like, I don't even watch this guy or this gal's channel. I'm just doing my work at the newspaper all day, and I don't have time to be listening to hours of live streams. And if somebody in the middle of hour 4 of an 8-hour live stream says something that's ridiculous and over the top, why am I being held accountable for something where it's like, and it's like, so the mainstream industry will do that to me. It's like, well, Doug is somehow best friends with so-and-so. And it's like, I don't even talk to that dude. I think I talked to that guy 8 months ago. What are you talking about? So yeah. I don't like that guilt by association game. And like you said, they always try and define you by the worst elements of whatever group that they don't like.
A lot of it is, it reminds me of the old Bugs Bunny cartoon with the 2 French chefs, where he's going back and forth saying, hey, did you know that he said this about you, and blah, 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 and starts a fight. And then he goes back and says, boy, if he'd have poked me in the eye like that, I'd be doing just gets him going back and forth, just stirring that pot.
Right.
But, well, anyway, we do want to seriously talk about storytelling in comic books, and that is why I wanted to reach out to you, because I'd seen some of your broadcasts before, and I knew that you had some keen insights. I wanted to have you on here to just kind of address the questions. And I've asked the questions that I had kind of wanted to get addressed, and we're coming up on the end of our hour here. Is there anything that I haven't touched on that you would like people to know that, is like about your books or about crowdfunding in general that is something that's important to you?
I would just say when people look at the creative teams that I've put together for Soulfinder and now for Black Tide, so we actually all like each other. And so I think sometimes when people look at creative teams, they're like, are these guys in it for the long haul? Are they going to do one book and then just like never do another book like for the rest of, forever? And so I think one of the things with myself, Tim, Matt Weldon, Brett R. Smith, Bill Williams, is we all like each other on a personal level and we get along together, but we also work together on a professional level and we like each other. And so if you're looking for stability in a team, in addition to people that value the craft of storytelling and the good, the true, and the beautiful in terms of art, I don't know. I think I'm biased, obviously, but I think that we're like a pretty safe bet. And Tim's track record for books and Matt's track record for books kind of speak for themselves over the past couple years now. So that's the good thing is people could just go to Iconic Comics and they could see the products and they could see that these are creators that actually really, really care. And they put their heart and their soul into whatever project they're doing at any given time.
Do you think that crowdfunding is something that's a new permanent thing going forward, or is it something that's hot right now while you have a couple of people making big spikes in sales and then it'll go away when all that dwindles out?
I don't see it going away at all because there's always going to be people that are really social media savvy. So whether it's Richard C. Meyer and he's got his, I don't even know what it is right now, we'll just say 130,000 YouTube followers or whatever, or it's Ethan or whomever, Ethan Van Sciver. There's always going to be people that they are really good at whatever platform that they use to augment or basically get support for their projects. And so they're going to have big numbers on their books. And then there's always going to be people that are starting out, that are hungry, that are building their channels, and they're just grinding it out and basically slowly over time building those that reader base up. And so, like I said before, the only thing that I really fear is these, whether it's YouTube or Twitter, just kneecapping you out of the blue because you said you made the wrong tweet, or the YouTube algorithm got you because they didn't like what you were talking about that day, or maybe some people don't like your channel, so they hit you with the bogus copyright strikes, but for whatever reason it's stuck. And so that's really the biggest concern for me. But I don't really see crowdfunding going away anytime soon. As long as you have good artists and good storytelling, you're good to go.
Yeah, I think scarier than Twitter or YouTube pulling the rug out from under you is there's even a greater reliance on Indiegogo and Kickstarter, right, the actual platforms themselves, and there have been cases where they've pulled things down because of complaints that were made, specious or not,
right,
about who was doing something. Kickstarter, I think, is maybe more notorious for that than Indiegogo, which is why you have all these people who have a political bias against doing the Kickstarter and prefer to go to Indiegogo.
Yeah, that was something that I recently talked to Tim about, and we were, I don't want to say we were scared. I was scared. I was scared about Indiegogo and Kickstarter and that very same thing, and basically being able to have a fallback area or a fallback plan where if for some reason I can't fund an Indiegogo or a Kickstarter, maybe I'll just have my own website and I could put in the infrastructure, whatever I need to do on my end to essentially crowdfund with my reader base and my email list if I have to do it. But yeah, so that is scary to think of some of these crowdfunding websites randomly sort of turning on you just like Twitter and YouTube could do.
Yeah, and there's only two big ones right now. Now, there is a third one I've recently learned about. I'm going to be exploring that a little bit more, called indiecrowdfund.com. And I'm going to be talking with the people who run that. And they've already got some books on there, like Mike Barron's Florida Man is on there. But their goal is to take these crowdfunded books and make them available at a price point for retailers to get them
Right.
into the local comic shops again, which is hard for a lot of these crowdfunded books because the price point really does have to come down for them to order in the bulk quantities. Is this anything that you've considered in the future for your upcoming programs on how to address that?
About getting the price point down, or
to get it into retailer hands.
So
or is that something you even think about with a...
The thing with the retailers is, I think sometimes they talk a big game about getting indie comic books, but then they don't always. So the retailers, if they want, they could reach out on Indiegogo or Kickstarter to any of these creators, myself included, if they wanted to, and we would be happy to work with them to be able to get the books into their stores. So this is just anecdotal, but I mean, there was one comic shop that reached out to me, and it was one of those things where it's like, I was willing to work with them. They're like, hey, we're interested in this, that, the other thing. I was like, okay, tell me what you need to do. I will get you the books. I'll cut you a discount. I'll do it. And then all of a sudden it just like falls through and then like never happens. And you're like, oh, okay. So I think that there are a lot of comic shop owners that are just, I don't know, sort of like anybody else, where they overpromise and underdeliver, or they're flaky, or they're weird. And so for me, I'm not going to jump through hoops for a bunch of comic shop owners who a vast majority of them are going to be flaky. But at the same time, if somebody reaches out to me and they're serious, I'm always happy to get Soul Finder books into stores. But in 2020, I just, like I said, it would be nice to be in stores, but I'm not going to do backflips for comic shop owners. I'm just not going to do it.
Let's get stores open first, and then we'll worry about getting stuff into them. All right. Well, Doug, I appreciate you being on the show. It's been a pleasure, and it's been enlightening. So I'm glad we worked this out, got a chance to do it. And I'd love to talk with you again in the future, maybe when you kick off the next Soul Finder book. We'll have you back on again if you're able.
Yeah, sure. I loved it. Thanks again for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for coming here. Everybody in the chat, we appreciate you being here. We wouldn't have a reason to do this if you weren't here asking questions and watching and sharing. Please do hit that like and share button. We've got plenty of subscribers, but we've got a lot of hours to catch up on before we can turn this into a viable channel. And we appreciate everybody being here. Good night, everybody.